Thank you for joining us for a virtual Fireside chat presented by America's Charities and SmartSimple software. For this episode, Jim Starr, CEO of America's Charities, and Dan Eardley, Senior Platform Solution Manager from SmartSimple software, will be talking about employee-assisted funds.
Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning for those of you joining us from the West Coast. We're really excited today to be able to chat a little bit about employee assistance fund programs, pick Jim's brain about what they have to offer in this space. Like Claudine mentioned, my name is Dan Eardley from SmartSimple software. Some of you may not know SmartSimple. Let me give you a little bit of an introduction, and then I'll let Jim introduce himself. But SmartSimple software is a cloud-based software provider based out of Toronto, Canada. We've been in business since 2003, and for the past year or so, we've been partnered with America's Charities and Jim to help provide software solutions around employee giving, volunteer management, grants management, as well as employee assistance fund programs. So we've worked with a lot of clients internationally. We're a global organization focused on some of those areas as well as other industries, but we're excited to be able to partner with America's Charities and especially in the space around employee assistance funds. So Jim, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure, Dan. Thanks so much. So I'm the president and CEO for America's Charities. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization that's been around for 40 years this year. We got started in 1980. And really what we're about is essentially helping raise funds for charitable causes. We've been doing that predominantly in the workplace with employee giving and volunteering programs, leveraging technology to facilitate that, and have also been offering employee assistance funds to companies that are looking for ways to direct their own CSR efforts actually inward towards their own employees. And be able to direct needed financial assistance to their employees that are in need for a variety of different circumstances. Anywhere from a qualified disaster, which typically we think of as a large hurricane or wildfire, but today that's also coronavirus. COVID-19 has been declared to be a qualified disaster under the IRS guidelines. But it could also include other things like medical emergencies, an accident, a single family house fire, a whole host of different events. So we've been working with companies and quite a bit lately on talking about what the different options are for organizations and looking to direct some assistance to their employees and in many cases helping them get those things set up. So really excited to, Dan, talk to you a little bit more about that and maybe just talk about some of the things that are some of the common questions that you're hearing, that we're hearing, and hopefully shed a little bit more light on this subject to our audience.
Yeah, that sounds great. I'm looking forward to being able to help people understand this a little bit better. Just for everybody's awareness, we'll be going ahead and tracking questions in the chat or Q&A section. So if you have questions throughout the session, feel free to post them there. We'll be covering a lot of content, so you may want to save some of your questions until later because we may answer it as we go along. But feel free to ask your questions there, and then we'll get to those at the end. So Jim, just to kind of start us off with establishing these types of programs, why would an organization, when they're looking to get started, why would they want to outsource to a 501c3?
Yeah, that's a very common question, actually. And it really starts with, what are my options? What are the different ways that a company can actually put an employee assistance fund program together? And there are a variety, and each of them has their advantages and their disadvantages. One of those is to actually work with a solution that's already out there, a partner that can already provide these services to you, and that is a 501c3 organization like America's Charities. The advantages of working with a group like us or others is that we can offer really kind of three key things. One, by working through a public charity, we can maximize the tax benefits of these programs, both to the individual that's receiving a grant through the program, as well as those that may be contributing into the fund. Those contributors could be the company themselves, it could be their employees, it could be actually anybody that's making a donation for their particular fund. Those contributions are tax deductible because they're being made directly into that 501c3 organization. But it also allows grants to be made from the program to recipients federal income tax free, regardless of circumstance. So that could be a grant that's being provided for a qualified disaster, those presidentially declared ones that I mentioned earlier, like coronavirus, but also for any circumstance in which there's a personal financial hardship and the fund is providing a level of assistance for. Those are provided tax-free as well through that 501c3 organization. So that flexibility is kind of one of the advantages. The second advantage is that you're outsourcing all of the administrative work associated with these programs. And trust me, there's a lot involved in that. So it starts with setting up your policy and understanding the IRS guidelines and making sure that you're creating your eligibility criteria and everything else in compliance with those guidelines, but then just the lift that's involved in having an application site, receiving those applications, reviewing those applications, tracking those applications, making sure that you have all of the documentation that's required for your program, and then dispersing those grants to the individuals. So there's a lot of administrative work that's involved just in having the program in place. And then thirdly, using a partner for the program provides a degree of confidentiality and privacy for those that are making application. And in some instances, in most instances, as part of the application process, the individual is going to be sharing some details about their situation and about their financial position. And that may be uncomfortable for some individuals, wanting to share that with somebody else in their company if it's being managed internally. So using a third party like America's Charities essentially provides that level of confidentiality and privacy for those that are making application into the program.
Yeah, I can see where that could be important for certain employees. I think you kind of mentioned a number of the points, but for those that may still be looking at doing it themselves, can the company do it themselves, can provide tax-free grants? What are the limitations on that?
Yeah, so companies can set up their own employee assistance fund on their own if they want. However, there are some limitations and some requirements that need to be met. For example, one of the requirements, if you're going to be doing this yourself or through a private foundation of the corporation, is that individuals in positions of authority or management positions cannot be part of the review committee or determining who's getting a grant and who's not. So there's limitations of who can be involved in that process. With respect to the grants themselves, the only time that they are provided federal income tax free is under a qualified disaster, like COVID-19. So there are actually quite a few companies today that we've had discussions with that have elected to, do this on their own for this particular qualified disaster because they can provide those grants tax-free. But if they're raising funds, unfortunately, those funds are not tax deductible because they're not going to a 501c3 organization. So, like I said earlier, there are advantages and disadvantages to each of those approaches.
Yeah, I actually spoke to another very large organization the other day where they're going down this path, and they're actually standing up their own new foundation to be able to do that. But not many people can do that, and that takes a certain size. And the other downside is that it's going to be months until that foundation is established, approved through the IRS and everything else. So if you're looking to get things up and running quickly, that is not a way that you want to go to be able to. That's definitely it's definitely a difficult path, and there are lots of corporations that have their own private foundation, Sure.
But they don't enjoy some of the flexibility that a public charity does. And there are some corporations, and some that we've worked with and work with now, have their own public charity. In other words, and so one of the requirements is that they have to be able to demonstrate that the majority, I forget what percentage of it is though, the majority of their funding is actually coming from public sources, not direct from the company. Yeah. Now that could be from employees, so you can meet that requirement through employee giving programs. And that's what many of them actually do. But there's other issues. You have to make sure, one, it does take time to do that. You can expedite that through the IRS. But that takes effort. It takes resources to do that. You've got tax filings that you have to stay on top of. There's all the regulations that you have to be compliant with. You have to have majority of board be independent directors, and there's a whole host of other things that go into that solution as well.
And
Plus,
the staffing component that you mentioned earlier too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The administrative work is still there.
Yeah, yep. Absolutely. So, with most people's interest right now around it being, COVID focused, at least for the interim, that's where everybody's priority is right now. What's the fastest way to set up a program and get it established, get money into the hands of the employees that need it?
Yeah, so one of the things that we and others also do is, we have a program that we call our Qualified Disaster Immediate Assistance Program. And it is an employee assistance fund, but it is focused on just qualified disasters only. If you're going to have just one little side note on EAFs, you can't create an employee assistance fund for a particular disaster. So you can't stand something up for this event, but you can stand something up, an employee assistance fund, for a basket of events or a category. So you can stand something up for qualified disasters, of which COVID-19 is one. And it's really obviously the most significant one that's out there. And so we have an immediate assistance program that really is a streamlined policy. It's very focused. Not a lot of variables for the company to have to try to decide, because when you're standing up an employee assistance fund, there are a host of decisions that you have to go through and make determinations on, and kind of just a whole host of things that need to get kind of mapped out. We try to do most of that already in the immediate assistance program, but do provide some flexibility for the company to determine eligibility requirements and a flat grant amount, because that's the other feature of the program, that it's based on a flat grant amount. Either someone qualifies or they don't. We're not trying to match dollar for dollar need to the grant. They just have to be able to demonstrate that they've been impacted by the disaster and are now experiencing a financial hardship that they can provide some level of proof or verification of. And that's kind of how that program works. And so it can get stood up rather quickly, or quicker than a standard employee assistance fund. And the application process is a little faster because it's a little bit more slimmed down. Not as high level of review that needs to be conducted, and a flat grant amount is provided for those that do qualify for assistance through the program.
That makes sense. I mean, as I'm sure everybody expects, we want to be able to be as streamlined as possible to be able to get those funds into people's hands that need them, at least based on those qualified disaster scenarios.
Yep, exactly.
So with those programs, we're talking about them as employee assistance funds and focused on employees that are in need. Can that program be available to more than just the employees, such as contractors, vendors, things like that?
Yeah, it can. A company really can determine who they want to make their program available to by how they're defining the eligibility requirements. So they're typically focused on an employee population. And some will include retirees. They may include immediate family members not in the household. And some can include and do include contractors, or those that they actually employ frequently, but not as employees. And we've had a lot of interest in some companies in which vendors are actually reliant upon them being in business for their workers to have jobs. And so they've expanded the eligibility to include those individuals as well. And so you can open up your eligibility to your fund to other people. It doesn't have to be just your employees. One of the key things, though, regardless of what approach you take with your employee assistance fund, is what the IRS calls your charitable class. Those are essentially the people that are eligible to apply for assistance. And the guidelines essentially state that charitable class has to be large. But in IRS fashion, it's not specifically defined. They don't say large as 10,000 people, or, there's no number that's attached to it. But they do actually provide helpful guidance that says one of the ways to meet this requirement is to make your charitable class indefinite. In other words, include future individuals. So if you're looking at an employee base, it's your current and future employees, is just an example. And so by making it indefinite, you've made it large, and you can meet that requirement. And so those same standards would apply to contractors, to vendors, to others that may not be employees.
Well, and just all of these types of scenarios and knowing that policy and knowing what the IRS requires, I mean, that's another benefit of being able to outsource this type of work to you guys, just because you already have dug into that, the requirements around those types of things and establishing those policies. So that makes sense. So for an organization that's looking to stand that up and, get a new program established, how should the program be funded? How do they decide where those dollars are coming from, who can provide them, how they provide that funding to you as an organization, if they're outsourcing it to you? How do they go about that?
Yeah, well, obviously funding your program is a pretty critical element to its success. And there are two common ways of funding an EAF. The most common is the corporation or the company is actually providing the funding themselves. And they're either doing that through, a philanthropy budget that they may have had, or, they've made money available, or they're doing it through their foundation, or whatever way the company is providing a level of funding into the program. Some organizations will do employee giving campaigns tied to their EAF. So in those environments, there are some companies that already have an employee giving campaign. And so they'll just make their EAF available and perhaps featured as a giving option, and maybe even do a special matching campaign around that to drive funds into the Employee Assistance Fund. In others that don't have a giving program in place, we can bring those giving solutions to the table, and we can implement a giving solution for their employee base to allow their employees to raise funds for their EAF as well. But in all instances, we strongly recommend that that companies provide what we call kind of seed funding. You need to provide some initial funding into that fund so that you can open it up quickly. You don't want to open up your employee assistance fund until you've got enough funding there to at least process the first month or two or three of applications. And so you want to make sure that you've got adequate funding at launch, and then you can use employee funding to help supplement as you go forward. Because it will take a while for employee fundraising campaigns to build up enough dollars, particularly if you're using payroll deduction, because those are monies that are only coming out every so often, not in one big lump sum. And so there's, for the giving program aspect of it, you can, again, companies are using organizations like America's Charities in partnership with SmartSimple and our Engage platform that can offer an employee giving solution. That's one option. We've got a couple of other, a credit card only donation portal that's fairly inexpensive and kind of easy to stand up very fast. There's other employee giving companies, software platforms, out there in other organizations. And so it's leveraging existing programs or standing something up just for this. And that's something that we actually work with companies in both ways.
So I'm sure, funding is certainly important. It's going to be most critical to make you successful in standing up this type of program. But I'm sure what other people are trying to assess too is what percentage of employees actually are going to request assistance and go through this. I'm sure it varies by industry and who's being most affected, at least during these qualified disasters and things like that. But do you have ideas of the percentages of employees that, seek this type of assistance through these types of programs?
Yeah, that's a tough question, Dan. It used to be an easy question. So prior to this pandemic, the kind of average application rate for programs, even during a typical year, which would include disasters, just nothing on this scale, is usually between 0.5% and 1% of the employee population. And that's pretty standard even across industry. Some may be a little bit higher if they've got a larger share of lower salaried or lower paid individuals that may be in more difficult economic conditions, or those that may have a larger number or percentage of their workforce in disaster prone areas. So they may be, so those are some of the things that may drive that percentage closer to 1% as opposed to 0.5%. But with coronavirus, it's an entirely new ballgame. And we don't have enough experience yet to really kind of get a handle on what we think, what these application rates are going to be. We anticipate they're going to be significantly higher. And they're going to vary a lot more based on the industries that individuals are working in. So obviously, the entertainment sectors and the food and restaurant and hotel and travel sectors have been hit, inordinately harder than other sectors. But there's other sectors also that have been hit as well. And so it's just, we haven't, and then obviously geographies and areas of the country as well, in terms of where coronavirus is more prevalent. So we don't have enough experience yet. We're hearing from our clients and the companies that we're talking to anywhere from 10 to 50% application rates.
That's significant, especially compared to that, 0.5%, 1.5% that you were mentioning earlier. So.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. Well, we do have a couple of questions that have come in too from the audience. One of them is, does the donor need to be the company? So this is kind of a unique question. Can an individual establish an employee assistance fund to benefit the employees of a particular company?
Yeah, they could if they wanted to. Essentially, so from we'll call it from like a legal or technical perspective, America's Charities is really, from a legal perspective, the fund owner. It is through us that the fund is being administered, and so it comes down to, who is working with us to set the parameters and the policy of that particular fund, and who's providing the funding for that fund. And so it could be, in just about every case so far, it has been the company themselves, or it's been a private equity company or a holding company has also done it for companies within their portfolio. So I think in that kind of a model, if an individual wanted to do something for a company, it could. One of the things, though, that makes these things challenging sometimes is for smaller companies. Because there is an administrative lift that's involved in getting the program set up, administering the program, dispersing the funds, those kinds of things. Sometimes those fees sometimes get a little bit too much for smaller organizations to be able to manage.
That makes sense. So the next question was related to probably what we see with a lot of employee giving, United Way campaigns, people that work primarily through the United Way. Do you see companies doing this in addition to the United Way type of giving?
Yeah. And I guess nowadays it really kind of depends on what the United Way is actually doing with the company. If they're running a more traditional closed United Way campaign that's just restricted to United Way and United Way agencies, the United Way may not be as willing or even able to add in their EAF as a giving option with their program. Particularly those programs are done once a year, as opposed throughout the year, and sometimes can't be stood up quickly for an event like this. And so in those situations, it makes it a lot of sense for a company to add another giving platform in for their EAF, so that they can raise funds from their employees outside of the United Way campaign.
That makes sense. So we have another question that just came in. Somebody who joined a little late, so they missed maybe some of the conversation, but I think it's worth sort of reiterating because I remember we had some advanced questions leading into the session around this topic. So if you can just kind of reiterate for everybody the focus around taxability of these dollars that are going to the recipient, what the tax status implications are, and the differences between doing it through an organization like America's Charities or trying to do it yourself as an organization.
Sure. So the short answer, Dan, to the question is it depends. And what it depends on is who's actually providing the grant. If it's being done through a public charity, through a 501c3 organization, that grant is free federal taxes, regardless of why it was being provided or what type of event it is being provided for. If a company is providing a grant and through a self-administered EAF or through their private foundation, that grant is only provided federal income tax-free under a qualified disaster, and provided it's being done in a way that's compliant with the IRS guidelines that regulate the administration of those grants.
Okay. So the next one, there's a number of questions related, so we'll work through them. So this person would really like to know more of the detail between the difference between an EAF and immediate assistance funds. So they're from a community foundation. They're looking at setting up a disaster assistance fund. Is it better for it to be an EAF and then activate differently in a disaster? When does it become a tax issue for the grantee? Does it matter in non-disaster time? So we talked about that somewhat from a taxability standpoint, but those are some of the questions that this individual has.
Yep. So yeah, there's a lot of questions wrapped up in this one question.
Yep.
So basically, an immediate assistance program, in essence, when it's being done by a 501c3 like America's Charities or like your community foundation, it essentially is an employee assistance fund. It's just a variant, of it. There's a specific type of assistance that's being provided, but it's still subject to all of the regulations associated with administering employee assistance funds. So with respect to the tax issues for the recipient, again, because it's being provided through a 501c3 public charity, there shouldn't be any tax issues for the recipient. Even in non-disaster times. So if someone were to receive a grant because they had a serious illness that was unexpected and they couldn't afford the hospital bills, then a grant can be provided to help offset that, and that would be done tax-free. The immediate assistance program, it's an expedited process that utilizes a flat grant amount that really is driven by a level of documented need. In other words, they either have a direct expense related to the disaster, I got coronavirus and now I have hospital bills, or living expenses, critical living expenses that they can no longer afford because of the disaster. I lost my job, I can't pay my rent and my utilities. And it's focused really on kind of critical living expenses. A couple of, one, and this wasn't asked, but I want to mention this. One of the things about employee assistance fund programs is that they are not to replace lost income. So just because you've been impacted by a disaster, and even you might have lost income as a result of the disaster, doesn't necessarily mean that you automatically qualify. There has to be some demonstrated need of hardship, that there is a financial need that is requiring assistance. The documentation requirements differ under a qualified disaster. You need less to little documentation in those events, but if you're moving into other circumstances beyond that qualified disaster documentation, you do need to have higher levels of documentation, some more verification. And even in the qualified disaster instances, it's a better practice to have some level of documentation as part of that application, as part of the application as well.
And with the flat amounts that you mentioned for the qualified disaster approach, is the intention there just to make it simple and as quick as possible to ensure that, each person that needs assistance, we don't need to judge how much or how little? Is that where that sort of flat amount is coming from?
Yeah, it's actually two things, Dan. That's one of them, and that's a big driver, is to help expedite that process and allow applications to get processed quickly so that assistance can get out faster. Secondly, with qualified disaster events, you're talking typically a larger number of people needing assistance kind of all at once.
Mm-hmm.
And so it allows an organization to say, hey, I've only got a fixed set of dollars. I want to make sure I can provide as much as I can to as many as I can. And so using a flat amount helps that process a little bit also.
Okay, that makes sense.
It's also cheaper to administer.
That's true. Less decisions to be made. So we've got a series of questions related to sort of when you mentioned the size of the organization and the administrative fees and when that becomes too large of a burden. So I think there's a few different folks that are interested in understanding, what does that number look like? So is it, there's especially one specific individual who said, we're a service provider with 500 to 600 employees. Does this make sense for them? Another person is looking, is that 250 and less, 500 and less? What's a general ballpark of where this becomes suddenly too much of a burden?
So that's a great question. And like just about everything, there isn't just a clean, clear-cut answer. There are other factors that are at play. I mean, because generally EAFs, where we're seeing more adoption, I guess is probably the better word for it, is at employers that have around 1,000 employees or more. However, we've actually got a good number of clients that are actually below that number, some as low as a couple of hundred. And so, but I can tell you in discussions, those companies also start to say, well, maybe there's different ways that I need to think about doing this. So what makes it easier for a smaller company to say, yeah, I want to go the outsourced route, even though I've got fewer number of employees? Some of it depends on their funding mechanism. They may just have more resources available to them as a company. So it's something that they can afford to do, or they've, got a very successful, foundation that sits behind them, or an ownership group that wants to provide the funding for a program like this. Smaller firms with, maybe a larger number of professionals that can raise dollars, for the fund may also be a contributing factor. So for the smaller companies, it starts to become more of, well, how much resources do we have as a company to actually put behind this? So it's not just the number of employees that kind of drive that. And those decisions, I think, start to get a little bit harder when you get under 500 employees. So if you're around 500, 600 employees, we found that we've been able to work with companies that size.
That makes sense. So this sort of piggybacks on that, and I know there's not going to be a set answer because it's going to be based on variables, based on different organizations' size, volume, everything else, the programs. But there is some interest in understanding what that fee structure looks like for setting up any EAF program through America's Charities. So if you can give a little sense of what that pricing model looks like.
Yeah, so I'm not gonna delve into specifics of the pricing, but I will kind of give an overview of how our fee structure is set up. It's really easy and transparent. We have basically two fees. One is an implementation or setup fee. That's a one-time fee that funds the costs associated with actually setting up your policy. So we sit down with you, we make sure that we've got the policy parameters designed to meet your objectives, but also be compliant with IRS guidelines. We set up an online application for your employees or your eligible population based on that policy. And then there's a bunch of back office stuff that we've got to put in place for your specific program as well. So it's a one-time implementation fee. And then we have an annual service fee or application processing fee. And those varies depending on program. The immediate assistance program is cheaper than the standard EAF program because there's less review involved. And there are annual minimum levels for that based on the number of applications. And so that fee is based on your projected volume of applications. And so our fees basically are designed around the level of effort required to successfully stand up and execute your particular program. We don't charge any percentages of funds that we hold for you or percentages on any grants that we disperse. There are no other hidden fees. We don't have change fees and things, basically it's those two things. We'll cover that.
That makes sense.
Dan and Jim, just wanted to get a question here from the chat box. If a company seeds an EAF, is that money tax deductible to the company?
Yes, it is. So the contributions that are made or donations that are put into the Employee Assistance Fund, those are being made to America's Charities, 501c3 organization, and those dollars are to be used for charitable purposes. So yes, they are tax deductible. The dollars that are associated with our fees, however, are not, because a service is being provided in return for those fees. But contributions and donations used to be granted out to eligible employees, those funds are tax deductible.
Thank you.
Great. So the next one we have, this organization already has a public charity established, set up separately from the organization. So they're in a position to be able to sort of manage this themselves. So they're wondering, is it recommended that HR be involved in the application review process, or does HR need to be notified of the hardship request in those types of cases?
Yeah, so it's not an uncommon practice to have HR involved in the review process, either as a frontline reviewer, one of the first people that are taking an application and making sure it's complete, checks all the boxes, and going through the application to make an initial recommendation on what the award should be, if it should be awarded, what that amount should be. So not unusual to have HR involved in that process. It just shouldn't be your SVP of HR or your Chief Human Resources Officer or somebody that's in that position of authority. And as far as HR being notified of the hardship request, that's an individual company decision on how they want to manage that. I think from an HR perspective, it's useful for them because they may be able to provide or direct the individual to other resources that they may not have known about. Lots of companies have employee assistance programs, which are different than funds, that can offer a whole host of other resources. And a lot of folks just don't know about them, or they may be connected into other community resources that could be available to them. So sometimes it's actually a benefit because HR is there to, there to help their employees.
Well, there's that benefit, but then on the flip side, just to kind of go back to something you mentioned earlier on, by having a program outsourced to another organization like America's Charities, then there's that sort of sense of privacy of, decision-making and what that person may be going through. So yeah, HR might be a great resource for them, but then that other thing they would want to weigh is, does that become sort of a privacy issue or concern with people seeking out assistance if that goes back to other folks within the organization? So,
exactly.
Yeah. So another question was related to funeral expenses. Do those qualify for assistance for, both COVID-19 for a qualified disaster, as well as maybe just for general employee assistance funds?
Yes. In the vast majority of cases, the answer to that is yes. That is one of the things that we work with companies when we're designing the program is identifying what types of expenses would be allowable under your policy. So there is no set IRS rule that says these types of things are good and these kinds of things are not. It's really a matter of practice and what is better practice. And funeral expenses are a common allowable expense under an EAF program.
Great.
Dan and Jim, I just have another question from chat here.
Sure.
Are there separate fees incurred with the SmartSimple platform, or is that included in the setup and annual fee?
Yep, great question. And when we get, obviously quite a lot as well. So the way that I like to talk about this is really try to keep things in two separate boxes. So in one, you've got the program associated with granting, dollars going out. That's your EAF, and the administrative fees and processing fees associated with that, and set of decisions. try to keep that contained in a box over here. And then on the giving side, if you're interested in actually doing something and raising funds from your employees and those outside of the organization, keep that in another box. Because there's a set of decisions around that, as well as separate fee structure for the Engage platform in partnership with SmartSimple, and other things that may be involved in the giving side of things. So they are two separate things, but we bring them together under this program, and utilizing a single organization to manage both pieces keeps everything together for you.
Yeah, and just to kind of piggyback on that, you would not be necessarily sort of like paying two organizations or having to work with both SmartSimple and America's Charities to be able to support these types of things. We are partnered as organizations so that, in a sense, SmartSimple is providing the technology solution that America's Charities is utilizing to be able to support these types of functions. So when we go through and you're looking to, if you're interested in looking for pricing on setting up a fund and having that program administered by America's Charities, it's going to be one, cost structure that's going to account for the use of the technology. So you don't have to worry about that being sort of a separate thing to be concerned with. So the next question that we had, Jim, was related to how those funds are dispersed. Who do they go to? So do you pay directly to individuals and or vendors? With paying to individuals, what are the options for dispersing those funds to those individuals? So what their options are for payment methods, essentially.
Yeah, it's basically any way that you can pay, we can probably do. And so for our EAF programs, we can structure those to pay the applicant directly. We could structure those to pay the vendors directly, or a combination of the two. With our immediate assistance program, that's set up to just the funds go directly to the applicant. So we're not paying vendors under the immediate assistance program directly, because you have to collect W-9s, you could be sending multiple payments, and so you're just adding more work, more complexity, more administration, and we're trying to squeeze as much of that out of the process as possible for the immediate assistance program. So we can do individuals or vendors and or both, depending on the program. When we're dispersing to individuals, we generally do that through one of two ways, but we can do three. So one's direct deposit. So we'd have to collect banking information for that. There's a secure way in which that's done. But what's popular also is e-check, where we actually email a check to somebody, and they can either print it, take it to the bank, or they can have that electronically deposited into a bank account. And so that's something that they can take care of on their end. Those are the fastest and lowest cost solutions. So those are the ones that we prefer. But if someone actually needs a hard check physically mailed to them, we can do that as well.
Okay, great. So another question we had was for an immediate assistance program, if someone's looking to establish that today based on the current needs, can that be converted to an EAF program more broadly after maybe, let's say, the current pandemic?
Yep, sure can. In fact, we've got quite a few clients in which they're standing up an immediate assistance program now because they want to get something up quickly and fast so they can help their employees out immediately. And then I think we're going to be revisiting with many of those probably this summertime, late summer, hopefully sooner. But as things kind of evolve, we'll go back and they'll be converting their programs to be a more broader, full traditional employee assistance fund that's going to cover a wider range of events, have more flexibility in it, variable grants being provided, all of the typical things that you'll find in a more traditional EAF.
That makes sense. So speaking to like vetting requirements, how you guys review these things, is there a verification that the employee is in good standing with the company, or, you certainly, that you guys need to verify that they are an employee of the company? What are sort of the steps that you guys take in those types of processes?
Yeah, so the easiest way is we ask our clients to provide us an employee roster. And so with a roster, we know because we already have that information. If someone attempts to make application that's not on the roster, we ask them to contact us or their HR department, and then we can work that kind of offline, if you will. Sometimes we can't get rosters, and so we'll request some level of verification. It could be a pay stub or a W-2 or something of that nature that verifies their eligibility or verifies their employment.
Great. So just as a follow-up to one of the previous questions, with the immediate assistance to EAF, can they go the other way as well? So essentially doing immediate assistance programs after an EAF.
Yeah, so if you have an EAF already established, kind of that traditional EAF, you can, rather than going from that to an immediate assistance program, you can actually create an immediate assistance program or element of your larger EAF. So you could have this expedited process for just qualified disasters, but continue to take applications in for other types of events that will go the more traditional review path as opposed to the immediate path. So you can basically create a separate program for your qualified disasters that's got the flat grant that expedites, that has all those components to it.
Makes sense. So we have another question, maybe our last, that an individual is trying to understand the difference between payments pursuant to IRC 139 for qualified disaster relief payments. So the difference between that and an EAF. So are EAF simply a different form of assistance under IRC 139 and that allows for payments to a broader constituency, or what are those differences?
Yeah, that's a great question. So basically IRC, the IRS code 139, which defines the qualified disaster relief payments, those are basically directed at corporations that are looking to be able to provide grants directly to their employees. So these are the regulations that kind of frame that and oversee that. In EAF, like if it's administered through America's Charities, it's being done through a separate, 501c3. So in that instance, it's a little bit different, though we do try to, the guidelines that oversee all of the employee assistance funds and even the qualified disaster relief payments, we try to make sure that we're structuring things in a very compliant way.
Okay.
It's funny, a lot of with the regulations around this and other things, there are some things that are very specific and other things that are just kind of not very clearly defined. And so trying to figure out where the right spot to be is in that is a little bit of an art.
That makes sense. As a follow-up to the vetting of employees and things like that, I think this individual is especially interested in maybe limiting it and maybe that they may not want to provide funding to an employee that's on probation or not in good standing, they've had behavioral or performance issues. How would you account for that if that's maybe one of the policy requirements that they would have?
Yeah, so you put that into the policy. It says an employee has to be in good standing. And then the roster that we would receive from the organization should only include those that are in good standing. And so if that employee is not on the roster, then they're not going to be eligible. And that roster file can be updated as frequently as the company wants to. Essentially, they download it into a secure file transfer protocol site, and it gets automatically pushed into the platform, so it can be done daily if that needs to be done.
That makes sense. So I think we've been talking about these things a lot. Maybe we just need to sort of give a refresher for everybody towards the end here. So the difference between an EAF and an immediate assistance fund program, like just again, sort of a reminder of what the differences are between those two things.
Yep. So an immediate assistance fund is an EAF. It's just a different style in that it is structured to be focused on generally qualified disasters only. Typically will have a flat grant amount and really have some of the policy requirements kind of almost preset. So that applications can be expedited, both in terms of completing as well as reviewing. So that funds can get into the hands of impacted employees faster. Regardless, the program still needs to meet basic requirements, triggering the event, created the financial hardship, ability to document it to some degree. The Employee Assistance Fund, in the what I kind of call a more standard or traditional sense, can be more expansive. It can cover more types of events, more variation in grants that are being provided. Typically has a higher maximum grant amount as opposed to it won't have a flat grant amount, and just different factors that are a part of that. So you can do an immediate assistance program, just an immediate assistance program. It's still an EAF technically, but it only does this one thing. Or you can have an immediate assistance program part of a broader, larger, more traditional EAF as well. So it can be a component of a larger EAF program as well.
Maybe it would be helpful for folks too, Jim, if you gave like some examples of what people apply for with a more broad general EAF program as compared to what people's focus right now on, with COVID-19 and things like that.
Yeah. So some examples. My house burned down. And now, one, I need a place to stay. Two, I need, I've got to have my house fixed, and my insurance deductible is $1,000, and I don't have $1,000. And I need, new furniture and this, that, and the other thing. And so they can apply for a grant through an EAF up to whatever that maximum grant amount is going to be and the types of expenses that are going to be allowable under that program. So that's one example. I got into a car accident. I totaled my car and spent 2 weeks in the hospital. So now I've got car issues as well as medical bills. And so that could be something that's covered. My spouse lost their job because they got laid off, and now there's a household loss of income, and now we've got an inability to meet our mortgage payment. So that could be another example of a type of event. There's a whole host of these things. My mother died, and she's in California, and I'm in Maryland, and I've got to fly out there and pay for a funeral that I can't afford. So that would be another example.
And all of these being dependent too on the program and the organization and what they want to support, of course.
Yeah. What we do is we'll sit down with the client and walk through some of these types of things. Are these the types of events you want to make sure are going to be covered under your program? As well as, are there certain types of things you're going to want to make sure you're explicitly not going to cover, right? So things like accumulated credit card debt, or I lost a lot of money betting on the Super Bowl. There's all kinds of stuff that, can be in there. There's also a lot of gray, despite best efforts to map out what's good, what's not good, there's still stuff that falls right smack in the middle that needs to get sorted through.
Sure. Well, and I think the next question I'll just answer pretty quickly, just from our previous conversations. So you can include former employees in the program. So if you want to have retirees, former employees, potentially contractors, vendors, it's really up to you on how you define those program requirements and how expansive you want that support to be. So just to cover that one real quick. The next question is around, again, sort of that application form process, review process, the standards. Do you require a debt to income ratio to determine financial need? Is that applicable in both cases, the disaster relief and employee assistance funds?
Yeah, we typically do not do a debt to income ratio. That can be one of the thresholds that we would look at for a standard EAF. Typically, it's not something that we're going to look at for an immediate assistance program. Generally, unless they're, what we're looking for in the immediate assistance is, how much cash do you have in the bank? Typically, you're not going to have much. Some clients don't care about that. Others do. And then the other is, are you in a position where your income cannot meet your expenses, particularly your core living expenses? And that right there will create a need, particularly under the immediate assistance program.
Perfect. All right.
Did we cover everything, Dan?
I think we covered everything.
We covered so much ground here. Thank you so much, guys.
Sure.
Well,
Okay.
I wanted to thank everybody for joining us. Jim, thanks for all of your expertise and being able to share that with everybody. I know there's a lot of interest in this. So if you're interested in reaching out, learning more about this, what's the best way for them to reach out to you, Jim, and America's Charities in order to be able to learn more about your programs and what you can support?
Yeah, I think if you want to just learn a little bit more, you can go to charities.org. I should have the URL for the employee assistance funds memorized. But there is, if you go into charities.org, you could even just search for employee assistance funds and it'll pop you right to the page that you need to go to. There's a contact form right there that you can fill out if you want to learn a little bit more, if you want to talk to me or somebody else on my team. We can go there. Oh, and actually, I do have the website memorized. It's charities.org/EAF. So that's charities.org/EAF. Give you a quick overview and in the contact page.
Perfect. All right, everybody. Well, I appreciate everyone joining. Hopefully, if you're interested in learning more, you'll reach out and be in contact with America's Charities. And from the SmartSimple software perspective, we'll be there behind the scenes, making sure that from a technology perspective, things are supported. You have the programming you need in order to be able to support these types of programs. So we hope to hear from many of you in the days to come.
Dan, thanks so much. Looking forward to putting my sweatshirt back on.
Me too. We're both in collars today. It's a miracle.
I know. I used to hate ties. Now I'm hating collars.